This is the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide on this journey, and today we are going to be revisiting our former episode on psychedelic narcissism with Adam Aronovich. Adam is a PhD candidate in medical anthropology, the creator and curator of Healing from Healing, trophy husband and dad. If you listen to the former episode we did with Adam, you know what a treat you are in for again today. So not to hype this up too much, but strap on your seatbelt because this is always a kind of free-flowing, really fun conversation, but it highlights a lot of important issues that need to be brought up in the greater psychedelic realm. So I'm very much looking forward to this. Now, before we get started, just a reminder that the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical or legal advice. And one more reminder, if you are a clinician and you would like to learn more about psychedelic medicines, please join the Psychedelic Medicine Association. It is our mission to get you educated on the latest in psychedelic medicine so you can have conversations with your patients, refer them when appropriate. And just a reminder that the Psychedelic Medicine Association is open to medical students as well, therapy students, nursing students. If you are in a graduate program of study in a clinical field, we would love to have you as well. And for those students, it's free. So head on over to psychedelicmedicineassociation.org and check us out. Now, without further ado, thanks for joining us today, Adam.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I'm very much looking forward to this. Even just before recording, you and I started chit-chatting a little bit about the topic, and we had formerly called this discussion Navigating Psychedelic Narcissism. But I think, our last chat was, I believe, in 2021. So
Yep.
about 2.5 years ago at this point. And since then is when you started Healing from Healing, which, if people don't know, is the best Instagram account you could follow. It will make you laugh on a daily basis and make you feel better about a lot of the shenanigans you see in society. But one of the things that you have been commenting on a lot lately is how, pop psychology kind of takes terms that at one point had a real meaning and trivializes them a little bit. And I think, as like you had commented to me before we started, narcissism is one of those words. So if we could just start off by talking a little bit about that concept and how what we so strongly called psychedelic narcissism 2.5 years ago, we now have to say, maybe let's find a better term for it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I absolutely, I think that the basic concept or the phenomenon that we're trying to describe through that term, psychedelic narcissism, definitely valid and definitely important. But since that last episode came out, right, I think like you mentioned, like a lot of people downloaded it and people were kind of like starting to like really relate to the term. And I kind of ended up feeling a little bit uneasy about that term just because I think it's not the most ideal way that we can express that particular phenomenon that we're alluding to, which maybe we can revisit in a little bit. And yeah, I mean, the reason being that narcissism maybe is not the right word that I would choose today in this particular context, precisely because one of the things that I have been noticing and criticizing a lot and researching to some extent through my account, right, is this idea of concept creep and how ideas that have validity, whether it's in clinical practice or in theory or praxis, in all sorts of different contexts, get decontextualized and then popularized through, well, mostly nowadays I would say like platforms, right, like TikTok and Instagram. And then the original meaning of the concept kind of just gets really diluted and applies to a much wider variety of things and experiences that aren't necessarily what that concept is supposed to allude to. Right? So we have things like narcissism, right? Which I think is like a very specific thing. But nowadays, like it's very common to find all sorts of takes about, like, oh, my ex is a narcissist, and all my exes are actually
All of them,
narcissists.
always.
All of them. My boss is a narcissist, and my mother is a narcissist, and everybody's a narcissist, right? And it's like, well, there's two options. Either we're going through a massive epidemic of personality disorders, and everybody really is a pathological narcissist, or maybe we have a very bad or shallow understanding of what that label actually means, and we're misapplying it when we actually mean things like, oh, like, my ex was a little bit selfish, or
Right.
like my mother like was a little bit self-absorbed, or like my boss doesn't have my best interest as a first priority. Like there's a much wider range of
Right.
experience and language that we can apply to those relationships, other than just like labeling and pathologizing everybody as a narcissist.
Yeah, that makes 100% sense, and I think a lot of what we were discussing, and I think that
Mm.
the concept is that very often things are hard to describe. So we're like, what's the closest word that could possibly easily describe this? Because I think what we were talking about in the last podcast is often how, and one example is people do psychedelics and some, their ego gets shattered. There's some ego dissolution and then it builds itself back stronger. And then that person comes out, a little ego forward, shall we say, which is definitely a thing that people kind of conflagrate with narcissism. But there's so many different concepts that fall into, I think, what healing, from healing, displays in your different posts and your memes, uh, that it's almost even too simplistic to just call it psychedelic narcissism. There's just so
Yeah.
many different concepts that I don't know how to kind of gently say it without taking ourselves or anybody too seriously, but the slightly more eye roll worthy, less savory, all the way to actually dangerous practices, right? There's a wide realm of what's going on there. Because I think what we were kind of discussing in the last episode was some people that they do the medicine, then they feel as though they now know and hold the keys to the medicine, and now I am your guru, and that's on the more dangerous end. Whereas I think healing from healing also displays some of the just more ridiculousness. So if you could, since our last chat, maybe talk about some of the categories of let's say less savory side effects of psychedelics that you may have pointed out in your account and in your studies.
Well, I mean, I think, to what you were saying, I think there's another concept that I think can be very useful in this context, which is epistemic humility. Yeah. And I think when when we can like try to characterize this experience of psychedelic narcissism, I think what we're really pointing out to is a lack of epistemic humility to begin with, and then all sorts of other character traits that can develop as a result or following from this lack of epistemic humility, which is this idea that I had access to forbidden knowledge and I am the only one who received this information and I am the holder of absolute truth. And hence, right, like the certainty. I mean, this is the thing is about the certainty, right? It's not about whether that idea is a good idea or a bad idea or universally applied. It's about the certainty that that person might hold about this particular download they have, or this particular pocket of truth that they access to, and then the certainty which with they will that as if it was not only true for them but also true for everybody else, and all the different things that happen from that. Yeah. So the narcissism in this sense kind of like refers to an experience that is self-absorbed, lacking epistemic humility, to some extent also lacking self-awareness, maybe lacking a little bit of context, right, in what it means to actually apprentice through a period of time with non-ordinary states of awareness, learning to discern, learning to integrate and process things, to not take them literally, but to see them in through a wide spectrum of different lenses, right? And then I mean, eventually, I think it boils down to our capacity to have like sense making and meaning, like proper sense making and meaning making processes in place, both individually but also collective, which in a kind of like in a very real sense is not necessarily an individual problem of the person that we're describing as being a psychedelic narcissist, but rather a structural problem of not having a good epistemic framework to make sense of these experiences in a healthy way, which is something that I think we're developing collectively as a psychedelic renaissance progresses. I think more and more people are starting to notice and realize the need that we have to better stories, like just better narratives, better storytelling, better ways to orient people to make sense of those experiences according to the accumulated experience of other people that have done that for a longer sense. So, and the epistemic part is crucial, right? Like epistemology, in the general sense of like the science of, knowledge. How do we turn information into knowledge and knowledge into wisdom? What are the structures that we have to discern? Like what's good knowledge versus bad knowledge? How to process that knowledge? How to gain information about the world? Which channels do we have to do so? And particularly when talking about psychedelic experiences, this becomes even much more convoluted and tricky. That regular experiences, because again, like we're talking about experiences that oftentimes seem to be truer than truth, right? Like they have a special validity in our pantheon of different experiences. The psychedelic experience tends to be extremely personalized, extremely powerful. We have this idea of the epiphany, right? Or the like the epiphany, like like the aha moment that oftentimes comes with psychedelic experience. So oftentimes that aha moment will entail, oh, like this is definitely 100% true. And if that's 100% true, then that's also something that I want to communicate and evangelize about. So we have many different processes that, like you mentioned, that oftentimes will derive, if they're not kept in check, it will derive in unbalanced, or at their worst, like really dangerous ways of engaging with psychedelics and engaging other people with psychedelics, right? Like this is kind of like the furnace from which gurus and all sorts of different power authority figures are made of.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I should have said this in the intro, but if I were a drinker, I would make it a drinking game to have a drink every time Adam says epistemic. I've always said this. It's my favorite thing. I was like, Adam, can you tell me what that means? I think you
Yeah.
always use the best terminology in our podcast. By this time, thank you. Now I know what it means. And absolutely, I love how you've described this epistemic humility. Like, essentially be humble about knowing what you now think is the absolute truth. And I I had this sense, and I rarely say anything even mildly controversial on my own show, but one of the, I'm thinking as you're talking, like, what are the ways that we can prevent some of this? Uh, because think about any other medical process, like, 'cause I see a lot of psychedelics from the medical lens, and rarely does somebody go to the therapist and then walk out and be like, I definitely have to be a therapist. I now have to provide therapy for people. Whereas the amount of people that do psychedelics and leave and think, I got to start serving medicine. I got to start being like, it's so much higher that people like, and I get that there's this lovely sense that people are like, man, this was so healing for me. I want to pass on this healing. But also there, in something like, for example, ayahuasca or the traditions that come with more indigenous roots, there's kind of like a whole lifestyle. And I'll see somebody go for their first medicine journey, and then suddenly they're like, all of a sudden they have like 10 native drums sitting in their bedroom, and this just like becomes an entire identity. And I think that, like, kind of the same thing with the psychedelic science is like, we're trying to get something FDA approved, and yet we still made it seem like you got it. Like, somebody put out that the dress code was going to be psychedelic casual. And I'm like, you can be a totally normal, straight-laced person wearing a suit and do psychedelics. You do not have to dress like you're on your way to see the Grateful Dead. You do not have to make this your identity, right? And I think that's is that, like, I think that's kind of what I see a lot of some of your memes about in healing from healing.
Yeah, I mean, like when it comes to ayahuasca, for example, plant medicines, I mean, you're right in the sense that it's not only becoming a medicine provider, but it almost always will entail kind of like buying into a certain lifestyle. But I think more importantly, the lifestyle, it means also attaching our identity to a particular aesthetic. Yeah, like the ayahuasca aesthetic, right? Like with all the different elements of what people perceive that to be, right? Like there's the Palo Santo burning and the Shipibo patterns and kenes and the intricacy of the geometrical design. And there's a very particular way that you express things very solemnly, right? Like so you put your hand on the chest and
The hand on the chest, the breathing. Oh,
right,
I'm
like
dying.
you got like a deep sigh of compassion and understanding with your hand on the chest and like hmm. Right, so the aesthetic is part of the performance that goes with that identity. It's an identity-based performance with a very strong aesthetic component to it. But yeah, people do get very attached to, because also like we have to, you know, very much remember that we live in the age of information, and social media is a major component. And like not long ago, I made a post about the spectacle, which is it's a concept that I like a lot by a French anarchist thinker called Guy Debord, and he talked about the society of the spectacle, right? So I made this post kind of highlighting different uh, video reels of people who uploaded to the internet themselves or other people in the midst of a very powerful psychotropic experience, whether that was with bufo or with ayahuasca, with cambo, right, like the frog venom. And it's really an incredible spectacle, right? Like you're witnessing a person go through like one of the most significant transformational experiences of their lifetimes, probably, but they chose to post that as content on TikTok, right? And so the spectacle part, the aesthetic part of it, is crucial in the age of social media. So if you want to be a medicine provider, right, you have to, well, I mean, you don't have to, but most people will choose to, right? Like buy into that aesthetic because you want to attract clients, right? Like people will say like, oh, who is this person? They're going to go see your Instagram page. They're going to see like, who are you quoting, right? Like, what is your vibe? Are you burning Palo Santo? Are you dressed in a particular way? Are you, when you record yourself doing your video reels and your Instagram lives, are you putting your hand in the chest very solemnly and sighing as you look at people with compassion? I mean, all of those things are kind of like part of that performance that will attract clientele, or at least will give you a sense of legitimacy and authenticity that people are looking for. So the spectacle, the social media, all of those things are kind of like intrinsically linked. As part of that carousel, just kind of like to finish this part, I wrote the last part of the caption was kind of like a take into like that Zen koan, right? It's like said like, well, if a girl does cambo in the forest and she doesn't post that to her TikTok, did the girl really do cambo in the forest, right? Which is a very valid question in the age of, performative vulnerability and performative authenticity and all of the things that kind of like create that interface between the medicine world and the chronically online world.
Chronically online. Can we just say, yes, dear listeners, if you do combo and do not post it, you have still done combo. We are giving you that permission to not post all of your experiences. I loathe when podcasters talk too much and they don't and they don't just totally focus on their guests. But for 2 seconds, let me just say this.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely, like that post about the spectacle was, I think I like actually wooed out loud in my living room because nothing has ever resonated so hard. I recently went to a 5MEO ceremony retreat that I paid good money for, and I had seen that they were posting on Instagram like at least a still picture of somebody getting their 5, and that's slightly less traumatic than watching the full video, but still, so when I arrived I said, and I should have specified this more, but I said, please do not videotape me in any part of this ceremony. And what I should have said is, please do not bring a camera at any part of this ceremony, right? Because like the second that you put up this thing, then it 100% becomes just what you said, performative. Like I don't go to a medicine ceremony to have somebody else watch how I do a medicine ceremony. I'm going there to go inward, right? And literally the response of the person was, okay, nobody record Lynn Marie. I was like, no, how is somebody missing the point this badly? The point is we
Yeah.
shouldn't have to be put in a position where any part of our transformation journey is going to be witnessed by hundreds, thousands, however many of people. This like and so I sent your post to a number of people who run retreats, and I say, do you get consent before you record your people? Because today I can't even go to a yoga class without the yoga teacher. I go to my boxing class and the boxing people have posted it. Like I would like to be left. Sorry that I'm old. I'm all of 45. I would like to be able to go somewhere and not have it show up, my sweating boxing face on Instagram, but definitely not in the middle of my 5MEO DMT ceremony. And so I really appreciated you bringing that conversation up. I think this conversation needs to be had significantly more with retreat holders, retreat attendees. And then, there are 100% so many people that part of their brand is just let me performatively journal for you in the morning. Watch me do my Kundalini breathing every morning.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you're showing me your journal every morning, how do we know? You are not going to write your ugliest, dirtiest moments if you're going to show all of us. Then your journaling is performative. This is just my own personal pet peeve. So thank you, Adam, for giving me that 2 minutes to rant about the spectacle, because it's having an absolute effect on our ability to do the healing that we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think, I think it's also a little bit, I guess, contradictory in many ways, right? In the sense that people supposedly uphold certain values, right? Because one of the main things, I guess, with plant medicine, particularly when people are sharing about it, right, is that people want to be like really vulnerable and people want to be very authentic about what are the kinds of experiences that they have. But then we also like at the intersection with the spectacle, right? Like that vulnerability and that authenticity become part of the spectacle in a sense that they become 100% performative. Like I think like one of the best examples that I have of this tendency is like, when I used to work in a retreat center in the Amazon, I ran probably hundreds of sharing circles, right? And sharing circles are one of the most powerful instances of the whole retreat, not only in my opinion, but also like through the interviews that I actually did for my research and collaborations for my PhD, right? Like a lot of people when asked like, hey, what were some of the most important or beneficial parts of the retreat or the workshop for you? It was like, well, the group sharings were particularly powerful. And when you get to the why, right, it almost always boils down to that sense of like authenticity and vulnerability, that it really allows people to some extent to rediscover a sense of mutual responsibility, right? Like when, like, hey, you know what, I can actually share about my struggles and my innermost fears and joys and struggles with a group of sometimes strangers, right? Like knowing that I'm not going to be met with judgment, but rather with compassion and understanding. And it's a really beautiful thing, right? But there's also like a degree in which all of that also becomes performative if we're not able to like really keep that in check, right? Because then sometimes it becomes kind of like a competition. Like, well, who's gonna bring down like the most powerful share? Like
Yes.
whose ceremony was the most transformative, right? And then people, instead of listening to what each other has to say, right, as they go one by one, as they await their turn to speak, instead of listening to people's experience, they're already crafting in their head, like, what am I gonna share to make it, be the most vulnerable, the most authentic, the most like, mind-blowing, soul-shattering, transformative experience based on, it kind of like becomes like an Ouroboros, right? Like a snake eating its own tail, where we go from like really appreciating and understanding why we need more authenticity and vulnerability in our relationships. So like that sense of intimacy with others that we oftentimes find lacking under kind of like the neoliberal commodified world, but at the same time, it very easily kind of like lies into that performative vulnerability. And social media is kind of like the worst example of all of this, right? I mean, it's exactly like you said, like any spiritual girly or any kind of like medicine person or anybody in this sphere who has like a personal profile where they, either are to some extent advertising their coaching practice or their integration services, they kind of like sort of have to play into that game of making people understand that they are, able to hold space for vulnerability and authenticity. But the way that is done oftentimes is, again, like through kind of like that ridiculous performance of Instagram lives or stories, where it's kind of like, kind of like a first person, say, like sharing very solemnly with a hand on the chest and like, guys, I want to share with you about all these things that happen. And yeah, I mean, there's a degree in which is nice for people to like really be honest about what it is. But yeah, I mean, more often than not, it really is a performance of performative vulnerability that more than anything is meant to convey a certain message to potential clientele and curate an image of that person in a particular way.
Yeah, and that's what's such a struggle for me on the more medical side, because if I'm trying to get my mother to go do ayahuasca, that isn't what she's going to respond to, and that's what I hope that at some point that there becomes, um a different strokes for different folks kind of message. Like, I would like the nerdiest person to come on with their hand nowhere near their heart and no deep sigh and be like, I'm really well trained in ayahuasca. I have set up a very safe retreat center for you. You will not have to inhale 1 pound of sage. Like, you can just come into, and again, like, still respecting the traditions. But I think, like you pointed out, there are the traditions, and then there's this new type of performative thing that I don't think has a lot to do with the traditions. I don't know. Again, you've spent much more time in the Amazon with these, but I don't know that the hand on the heart sigh thing is all required to do the parts that are actually really important for the
I
for
mean,
the transformation.
performance is and has been like a very important central component of medicine in every medical system, right? Like, I think Arthur Kleinman is kind of like a very famous medical anthropologist, one of the OGs of medical anthropology, and he kind of like turned the look into like the biomedical system, right? And he kind of gave a very astute observation about how the whole visit to the medical doctor in the West has been also embedded within ritual, right? Like, you go to the doctor's appointment and the doctor is wearing a white robe and the stethoscope around, the neck, and there's the diplomas on the wall, and there's a very specific demeanor that the doctor kind of like abides
Yes.
by, right? But
True.
everything in that interaction is meant to be in some way a performance with a very specific
Yes.
outcome. And that outcome is to instill in the patient a sense of respect and authority on the person that is providing medical care for them, right? You want to know that the person who is examining you and diagnosing you and prescribing a solution for your problem is actually something that you can trust. So that whole complex of white robe, stethoscope, diplomas, and so on and so forth is kind of like meant to convey authority. Like, hey, I know what I'm doing. I went to school for 11 years. I did
Yeah.
this long as residence. I basically sacrificed my life to be able to be here with you, and hence you should listen to what I'm saying. And it's not very different in other medical systems, right? Like when I in the Amazon rainforest, one of the things that I noticed very early on when I was working in the ayahuasca retreat center is that something extremely similar to that was happening in every retreat. Whereas, when people come to the retreat center where I was working, it's an hour-long walk through the dense rainforest, and always when a new group came, there was the same ritual, which was how did we receive a group? And how did we receive a group was waiting for them across a bridge where they can see us, from the bend. And across the bend, there will be the whole team of that retreat that will be standing. Okay? So it will be like 4 or 5 Shipibo healers, 2 Western facilitators, maybe one of the teachers, and so on and so forth. And it was required and demanded from all the Shipibo personnel that whenever the group came in, they must be wearing their best traditional Shipibo regalia, from head to toe, dressed as a Shipibo with all the kushma and the hat and smoking their mapacho, and like kind of like the picture perfect image of what a Shipibo shaman should be like. The interesting thing is that they don't wear that at any other instance, almost. Like they don't wear that shit, right? I don't say that despectively. Nowadays people in the Amazon rainforest, for the most part, they wear t-shirts and jeans, and they have cell phones, and they have Instagram, and like this idea of kind of like the noble savage, it's kind of like a very decolonial attitude. So, at some point I was like, it's a little bit demeaning and annoying that we are forcing the Shipibo shaman, well, shaman is not the right word, but it's, they officiate in that role in this particular context, that we're, forcing this Shipibo onaya, right, to dress in a particular way, right, that we expect them to wear all the Shipibo regalia and be dressed as kind of this caricature of indigenous perfection as we receive a new group. But the function of it is very similar to what I just described in the doctor's room, right? Like people are coming here to the jungle, flying in from New York, from LA, like they have an idea of what an Amazonian shaman is like. And the first contact with these people that are going to be doing energetic work on them for a whole week has to be one of like, wow, like, yes, like that guy is authentic because they're wearing the right things, right? Like they're wearing the right hats,
Yes.
they're wearing the right thing, they're doing exactly the same thing that I, a naive Westerner, would expect from a Shipibo shaman. They look the part, and so
Right.
they must be the part, and so on, right? So it's like that performative aspect is crucial to instill a sense of trust. I trust you
Yeah.
because you're wearing the things that I trust you wearing.
Right. No, that's a very good point. That is a very good point. And I, like, thank you for reflecting back on my own bias, which is I am comfortable with the medical performance and I'm less
Yeah.
comfortable with the, so, the Psychedelic Medicine Association, we work with Psych Congress and we run the Sauna Symposium, and we were having the meeting about, what we're going to present. And somebody from CIIS was there, like, the California Institute for Integral Studies. And, we were telling her, like, this audience is not woo. Like, this is the least woo audience. These are like clinicians, and I just think about like that audience showing up, if I was like, okay, look, guys, the medical practice comes with a lot of exposure to things that are going to be traumatic over the years. It may be very helpful for you in your burnout or whatever to go to an ayahuasca center, and then the person that they encounter is one of the like hand on heart, deep breath, and they're just going to like kind of misfire. Like, what is this that it's just uh, like you said, it's not. None of these are the required actual thing. Like we could have a Shipibo healer show up in the t-shirt and jeans without the regalia, without the mapacho. We could have an actual very well-trained leader who doesn't have to like, do this performance of compassion, just kind of have compassion. And then hopefully people, we could find ways to, let's say, attract the most clientele from, I'm a big fan of patient access, and we don't want this to seem like you have to be comfortable with this certain kind of, hand on heart, for better lack of a better terminology, performative means of it to feel comfortable to go to it. And so I just like how you help bring light to these different aspects that we're just so used to seeing. But yes, this is kind of a performative, and it does attract clientele and it does serve a purpose. But let's look deeper into the reasons that it comes off that way, because it's not required. Can you talk a little bit about, because sometimes your account also gets into, like I was alluding to, some of the more dangerous sequelae, and I think a whole lot of this falls into the, like you said, the knowing what you know and it's the truth, and especially when that is not so true. I think you had some great commentary on some of the speakers at Psychedelic Science that I appreciated that were not so, let's say, science based. Can you talk a little bit about? I don't know how to even like guide you well into this question, but maybe how, and I think we talked about this last time, how the experience of that thinking the absolute truth can turn into a darker, less uh less informed actual place.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, these are again like these are tricky things, and again, people are gonna have to take many shots now because epistemology really is at the base of it, right? Like I think not only epistemology, but actually this, the brother or sister of epistemology, which is also a word that is repeated often in these scenes, but the ontology of things, right? And this is where we start getting like into really complex and really interesting things, right? So, for example, when we come to ayahuasca in the rainforest, yeah, like we have to understand that there are fundamental differences in the way that people experience the world in a very, very basic, radical, ontological, and epistemological way, which basically means, right, that people in the rainforest, right, like the Amazonian people, for example, in a wide generalization, don't subscribe to the same basic ontology that we do, in which that the world is basically made of matter and everything is just an interaction of cause and effect between atoms, and kind of like a Newtonian mechanistic clockwork universe. Like that doesn't make any sense whatsoever for an Amazonian person who experiences the world through an animistic lens, right? And what an animism basically means, again, like a wide generalization context, is that the basic units of the cosmos are not matter, but rather humanity or consciousness or spirit, like different words for what it means to have like that kernel of shared commonality in the sense of self-awareness, right? So people, right, there's human people, but there's also non-human people. There's bird people and tree people and river people and jaguar people, and everybody is people, right? Like the personhood is the thing that is shared amongst all things in the universe. And what changes is like the clothes that we wear, right? So I'm wearing a human clothes, but the jaguar is wearing jaguar clothes, and the bird is wearing his bird clothes. But the essence that is humanity, they call it, right? And what that means basically is that all of the things that in the West we tend to ascribe only to humans, right? The qualities of intentionality, of agency, of feeling emotions, of feeling anger and resentments and acting upon those things and planning for the future and like taking care of our kin, like all those things that are ascribed to everything else in the environment. So the basic premise of the Amazon ontology gives rise also to the medical system, right? Because the medical system is not a system unrelated to the underlying culture, but something that emerges from the underlying culture. And hence, ayahuasca practice in the Amazon is inherently animistic, right? Inherently embedded within a particular ontology that is very difficult for people to grasp. And as one of the examples, for example, that I find very, very interesting is that um, when you ask like a Shipibo healer, like, hey, what is the main medicine for you that you use, right? People would assume, oh, well, it's obviously ayahuasca, right? But that is never really the answer, because from the perspective of the Shipibo healer, ayahuasca is just a vehicle. It's a medium that they use in order to connect with a different thing, right? So when you actually ask them, like, what is your medicine? They will say, well, my medicine is my icaro, right? Like the song that I sing, the melody, the tune that I sing to the person that I'm healing, right? Which is oftentimes also an invitation or an invocation, right, of the arsenal of different entities, spirits, plants and things that they have communed with through the process of initiation into the medical system that they're a part of. So when a person comes to the rainforest and they're like, oh, like I'm just gonna drink ayahuasca and this person is gonna heal me and this person is singing to me, I don't understand why he's singing to me, but whatever, I'm just gonna sit there and take the experience and so on and so forth, right? They will understand it in a radically different way than what the person actually doing the healing is experiencing or doing, which is much more complex and rooted in a completely different way of understanding the world than that other person is. So the thing that happens oftentimes, I mean, in this case, like the Shipibo ontology, right, is so radically different than the metaphysical systems that we're acquainted with or ways of understanding the world that we can connect with, right? that is like very, very, very difficult for people to actually make sense of them, not only make sense to them, but actually experience and perceive the world in a similar sense, and even much more difficult to transmit those ideas onward to other people. Right, so you see like a bunch of different people who come to the rainforest and they want to learn the Shipibo medical system, and they spend maybe months, in the best case scenario, a few years dieting and dieting and dieting and learning from the plants and learning from the spirits and learning from the medicine and learning from the Shipibo healers. But when they try to actually explain or convey what it is that they're actually doing, right, like the explanation is always going to be a caricature, right, that doesn't nearly match the breadth and scope and the richness of what the ontology that they're drawing from is. Right? It's almost always, unless in exceptional cases where a person has like incredible capacities to really connect with a different worldview and the cultural sensitivity to make sense and learn the Shipibo language, which is a very basic thing if you really want to understand a culture, maybe through the language it would be. So what ends up happening, or more often than not, is that we fill in the gaps with our own ideas, and those ideas oftentimes draw inevitably, right, from neoliberal New Age spirituality and kind of like the things that we bring with us from our own kind of like cultural milieu, right? So you will see a person who is purportedly practicing plant medicine from a Shipibo lineage, but then when they need to fill in the gaps of the things that they don't quite fully understand, then it's gonna be kind of like, again, like this regurgitation of like new agey, pseudo spiritual, whatever. And I'm not saying this despectively per se, even though I do have some contempt for many of these things, but that's my problem, not everybody else's. Yeah. But what ends up happening is kind of like this word salad that draws somewhat from Shipibo ontologies and somewhat from an Amazonian perspective, and a lot from other things. New age spirituality, pop psychology is a huge one. Kind of like now we're getting into the meat and bones of what healing from healing is. But yeah, I mean, all of these different things, from pop psychology to new age spirituality to kind of like medical libertarianism, which is kind of like very common amongst the awakened light workers and so on and so forth. And what ends up happening really is that the person thinks or feels like, oh, I'm part of this Shipibo lineage and I'm practicing medicine according to what my teachers told me. And in reality, maybe there's a flavor of it, but or the vast majority of whatever it is that they're passing forward is just kind of like their own regurgitated flavor of unacknowledged and oftentimes unconscious repetition of new agey tropes and cliches and pop psychology concepts and things that they think they understand, but not quite really. And again, I'm not generalizing. Okay, if somebody's listening to this and you feel attacked personally, this may not apply to you. I'm just saying, in my personal experience, the people that I've met, the people that I work with, the people who don't have that modicum of self-awareness and epistemic humility to really understand with intellectual honesty the scope of their understanding and knowledge, then it is very easy to overdo it, and then we do a disservice not only to the actual traditions that we purport to be portraying, but also to the people that we're working with.
I appreciate you bringing up that last part, and it does remind me the fact that of the 137 episodes we released, people have only felt personally attacked by your episode. and I thought that was hilarious. I mean, people, it was funny how many people in the comments were I think they're like, well, but you got political. And I think that, like I have always said when swiping Bumble, anybody who puts apolitical, if you are not political, you're not paying attention, right? And
Yeah,
so it's never not going to be part of the conversation.
not being
And
political is
yes, please.
actually one of the, not being political or pretending to not be political is actually one of the dumbest and most naive political positions that a person can take. Everything is political. Healing is political for sure, right? Like we're engaging with healing. And this is one of the most insidious manifestations of healing culture, as it draws from kind of like the new agey, spiritual bypassing, apolitical pretentiousness, which is like, if I just focus on myself and I heal myself and I peel the layers of the onion of all the things that I need to work on myself. Right, one of the cliches that is most infuriating within this milieu of apolitical healing culture is always the best gift that you can offer the world is your personal healing and transformation. Not only that, but there really is no use in putting your attention anywhere else, because the only the only locus, the only place where healing and transformation can happen is inside yourself. And this is like the most insidious expression of what neoliberal solipsistic disconnection, right, is, that is expressed through views like, oh, like we don't have to bring politics into it. No, if you don't understand that your healing is political, because individual health and individual happiness and individual everything is intrinsically related to collective health and social health and cultural health and environmental health, then you need to go back to square one because you haven't understood anything. If we can't even fathom that perhaps my own well being is in constant dialogue with the well being of a society, the well being of a culture, the well being of an environment, right? That nobody can be fully happy and healthy unless everybody else is relatively healthy and happy, then we are in big trouble and we haven't really learned anything.
Easily my favorite 2 minutes of the entire 137 episodes I've released. Thank you, Adam. Yes.
We can use that. We can use this as a snippet.
Jared, our content manager, is on that. Trust me. That was beautiful. And thank you. So well said and so needed to be said. That absolutely the apolitical healing. What did you call it? Apolitical healing rhetoric or something. I should have written it down, but it was very good. But yes, thank you. And I think that's one of the reasons that I so appreciate your content, because it points out these kinds of things and how, you know, words are overused very often, but a word that really does apply, I think, in this situation is like the privilege you have to think that healing yourself is going to heal whatever. That must mean you are not being, subjugated by anything else currently. And, I'm thinking of anybody of color or lower socioeconomic status, or all the people who, a lot of people need to do some healing systemically before they can even start to heal, right? Like, come on, like it's just such a like you said, it's a naive perspective that continues to get propagated to where it's, people think like, oh, now I've reached the point that I have this perspective. No. Follow other people, follow Adam on Healing from Healing. Understand that is not that. And I think that's, kind of at the root perhaps of why it was easy to call things psychedelic narcissism at the get-go, because narcissism is more that like, I am of the utmost importance before all others. And that is kind of what that apolitical stance that you were talking about. As long as I heal myself, we're fine. And that's just the least. I think you had posted even a bell hooks quote that was something about like, if you don't see healing as a healing your society, healing in community as the core thing, then you are missing the point. I think that was one of your first posts that I was like, ooh, this is good, Adam. This is the kind of content that people need to be hearing.
Yeah. And I mean, it isn't at all surprising that people end up in these situations of thinking these things, particularly, and again, like I oftentimes do make the distinction because, the Western culture edifice is not homogeneous at all. And I do think there are many differences in the extremities of some things. And I think like in the US, for example, like this is way more exacerbated. Like the hyper individualism, the neoliberal grasp on the identity of a person as a individual disconnected from any network of interdependent relationships does tend to be extremely powerful, have a powerful grasp on the experiences of North American people, more so than in other places. And also because the political system, I guess, like the bipartisan model, is so obviously dysfunctional that I think like a lot of people who don't really have a deeper understanding of what political means will refer to politics as just kind of like a dichotomy between conservatives and liberals that fuel the culture wars, which is absurd. Like, hey, like we don't have to bring politics into it. Well, sure, we don't have to bring, like red versus blue, but that's not what politics means. Like that's just another caricature that prevents people from actually looking deeper into what being political can mean beyond kind of distractions of obviously dysfunctional system.
That's a very good point. I used to work in nonpartisan election reform, which was very political, but not partisan. And I think you're right. People confuse being political with being partisan all the time. And I think that's, like you said, not a surprise. I don't remember our civics class at any point in grade school or high school defining those things. But it does make a lot of sense that people don't want to be identified with one side or the other. And so they just say, oh, no, I'm not part of any of this.
Well, we end up with really absurd situations. Like now, like climate chaos is now a political issue. And according to what ideology pack you subscribe to, then you have to also kind of like take that as part of your ideology package. So if you're conservative in the US, I mean, not everybody, obviously, but it's becoming more common, like, oh, like climate change is just like a liberal hoax to keep us all enslaved in 15-minute cities, right? Like, and it's like, well, I mean, if you're thinking that climate change is just like a liberal thing, I mean, there's already something that requires you to go back to school and start getting some political literacy, because this is not it. Yeah. And the other way around, like, I mean, there's all sorts of different things, like, that can be said about other things, like some important things that conservatism actually has to offer. I mean, there's a reason why conservatism has been a cultural force for so long, that it doesn't have to do with fascism or bigotry or all the things that kind of like naive liberals ascribe immediately to somebody who votes Republican in the United States, but rather like, hey, like, yeah, I mean, maybe they're, being progressive is great, but also like there's a need for people to recognize that perhaps things have been certain ways because there's a reason why they have been certain ways, and not necessarily that every issue needs to be weighed against the value of tradition, right? But actually there's a good dialogue to be had between progressive tendencies, but also conservative tendencies, which may hold some truth in certain issues, not all issues, but certain issues, and vice versa. So political literacy is important beyond kind of like just like easy cop-outs with false dichotomies.
Right, very true. And before I forget, I want to give you the soapbox to talk about the word trauma, because we touched a little bit into the pop psychology, and we talked a little bit about how the overuse of narcissism. But I see that you and Jules Evans, other former podcast guest, seem to have a lot of Instagram back and forth on this, maybe the overuse or the over traumatization of our society. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
My friend Brian James has a good word for it. They call it traumadelic culture, which is kind of like this holy alliance between psychedelic culture and trauma-informed culture, deriving in this traumadelic culture, where trauma is and remains kind of like the primary lens, not only of analysis, but also of understanding, right? Like this is kind of like, again, like a very Gabor Matian perception of adult dysfunction as resulting exclusively from childhood adverse experiences. Not only Gabor Mate, but I am a graduate of his psychotherapeutic program, and I spend a lot of time practicing and learning about Gabor's approach. So I feel more comfortable making this statement. The Gabor Matian approach really is like very reductivist in that sense, that really does tend to consider adult dysfunction for the most part, almost always exclusively, at least maybe not in theory, but at least in praxis, through the way that practitioners are trained. Like the whole approach is identifying what happened to you when you were a child, and then what belief system emerged from that, and how is that affecting you as an adult person, right? And I think Gabor Mate has had a big influence on plant medicine world for many, many years, right? It was one of the pioneers, kind of like bringing ayahuasca to the forefront of clinical uses. Like, hey, like this is not only hippies in some backyard or, people kind of like traveling to Peru, but actually we can use this in a more medicalized or psychologized or psychoanalyticalized way, right? To excavate, what it is that happened to people in their younger years that made them be who they are. And this is an approach that is useful to some extent and also very problematic to some extent. I think, from my own experience working in ayahuasca retreats, definitely one of the narratives. I would say the main narrative that was very prominent and present in the center that I work with was that ayahuasca's primary purpose is to help people understand their childhood trauma. Okay. Now, when you think about, and this is, by the way, nothing to do whatsoever with any actual indigenous tradition that uses ayahuasca for everything else, right? And maybe part of it also is like the personal healing that can come with understanding who we are better through understanding our adverse childhood reactions better. But traditional Amazonian ayahuasca uses are everything but that level of highly psychologized, medicalized, personalized approach. Very different thing. We can go back to that later. But just kind of like talking to the kind of like Gabor Matian approach, right? The place that I work with did have that, not necessarily explicit as like, hey, like everybody that comes to the center, you need to know that the purpose of ayahuasca is to help you excavate your suppressed and repressed childhood memories so you can work through your childhood trauma and understand why you had depression and anxiety and so on and so forth. Even though that was the subtext and something that was repeated by every facilitator in the center in some way or another. So it was very evident to all the participants, right, that that was what they were there for. They came to drink ayahuasca because they needed to work through their childhood trauma. Implicit, but very clear. And I came across many situations that were worrisome for me. For example, situations where uh, a person would have a series of incredible ayahuasca experiences, like maybe transpersonal experiences, maybe incredibly emotional experiences where they connected with their parent and they had like this cathartic release of emotion, or psychic surgery performed by the entities in the hyperspace, like really like life-changing, like onto epistemic re-enchanting kinds of experiences. And you talk to them after ceremony or the day after, like, oh, I had this super cool experience and this happened and that happened. But then the end of the workshop arrives, right, and we had like the closing share, and then this person would, it would be their turn to speak, and this person would be like, well, I'm feeling a little bit disappointed because I didn't get what I came here for. And like, what do you mean? I mean, we spoke about your experiences. We spoke about your incredible voyages into hyperspace and transpersonal awakenings and, cathartic emotional releases. And like, yeah, but I didn't really tap into my childhood trauma. Right. And those are like the instances where I'm like, we're like really missing the mark here with the narratives. Like, what are the stories that we're telling people what these things are for? Are these really the best? Is this really the best way to frame what an ayahuasca works, and what is this ideology coming from? Where are these ideas coming from, right? So a lot of that does have kind of like trauma-delic culture, the Gabor Matian influence, right? But also like just in a very general sense, the way that pop psychology, in this case, or well, I mean, this is not necessarily pop psychology. I mean, I do think, for example, the trauma-informed approaches and practices, and like the complete domination of somatic approaches nowadays, which is very tangible. I mean, all of these things are useful. Not saying that they aren't, right? They are tools, are important in an arsenal of tools. There are approaches that are important as orientations for people who can connect with those approaches, right? But the idea that everything about medicine work will be reduced to tapping into childhood trauma and then working that through some sort of somatic process of like locating that trauma in your body. And I mean, this is a very reductive and yeah, like it's a shame that a lot of people don't necessarily are not necessarily held for the much wider range of valuable and positive experience that a person can have when we're exclusively focusing on that narrative. There's other things that are even more worrisome than that. Like, for example, when I was facilitating workshops, we had a variety of different teachers. Some teachers were kind of yoga teachers, some meditation teachers, trauma-informed teachers of some sorts. And we had a few people that were like very trauma-oriented, like very trauma-informed, very trauma-oriented. And, during the workshops, like, for example, they would do things like not only teach some classes about like trauma education and so on, but like sometimes like, kind of like leave sheets in the tables for the group to read during lunchtime and everything about like trauma, 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 trauma. And then I would do like the interviews at the end of the workshop, for example, for my research project. And the vast majority of people in that particular group, right, will report back that the experiences that they had in that workshop during ceremony were almost exclusively oriented in some way or another towards like them discovering their trauma. And some of them had amazing, experiences, like really tapped into something that was very important for them. Other people didn't, and other people experience very vague recollections of things that might have happened, but not sure what happened, right? The hyper focus not only on trauma, but in like childhood sexual abuse experiences, for example, is an incredibly tricky terrain to navigate, right? Incredibly tricky. And if the person is not skilled enough to be able to communicate properly and help people in the epistemic part of the interpretation, sense making, meaning making of experiences like this, then it can derive in incredibly dangerous, risky situations, not only for the person who might then kind of get a new mind virus about something that might have happened, but they're not quite sure if it happened, but also maybe have implications for other people in their lives who are now suddenly at the focus of some horrible incident that they're not really sure whether that happened or not. In the actual discipline of psychology, right? Like there has been a debate that has raged for decades in the field of recovered memories, right? Like back in the, I think it was the 80s or the early 90s, like this gave rise to one of the worst incidents of, social contagion when it comes to like the satanic panic, where all sorts of different therapies were suddenly oriented towards like satanic experiences of childhood abuse, and like people were kind of like reporting that, and like that had a massive impact in people's life. I'm not going to tell this story because I'm not an expert on it, and there's plenty of information people can tap into. Maybe we can put that in the show notes later. But the idea that there are certain techniques or certain approaches that will provide you privileged access to repress or suppress memories, particularly of trauma and particularly of childhood abuse, that maybe we don't have access to them because they're too painful and so on. And even like the validity of psychoanalytic concepts such as suppression or repression like is questionable. This is not something that is like accepted across the board as a valid thing at all, right? But when we're imposing that into something as sensitive as actual experiences or recovered memories and saying like, well, if a person drank ayahuasca and they had a vague vision of being molested by that uncle, and we just take that literally, and we not explore different avenues with that person, but just kind of like fuel that interpretation, like, yeah, like this definitely happened and you definitely have to take action, and now that's a story that you're going to carry with you for the rest of your life and have an impact on other people. I mean, this is a very tricky thing. So the whole point of this kind of like, when we're talking about any technique or approach that focuses on recovering or uncovering or excavating suppress memories of childhood events is something that needs to be navigated with a lot of care and with a lot of skepticism as well. So we're not actually making things much worse. So that's kind of like one of the things I personally, in my plant medicine work and the trauma-oriented approaches, have come to like just like notice. And I think it's important for people to take a much more nuanced and complex approach to what these things are. And again, like we come back again to the beginning, the psychedelic narcissism part, which we are yet to find a better term of it. But if we're not able to like really have that epistemic humility and understand that actually ayahuasca doesn't show us the truth every time, and is not to be taken literally. And actually, there's no reason why the spirits of the plants have to be always as benevolent as to give us all the right information that's going to help. I mean, these are all like really new agey fantasies that don't really have a root in reality. And it's very difficult to navigate these things with the care and the compassion and the epistemic humility that they require. It's important to understand there's a massive complexity on the sort of visions that we have and sort of communications that we receive. If we just kind of like fall back into like a very simplistic romanticized idea, oh, like we're just channeling cosmic truths from the cosmos, and then we're setting ourselves and others for at war, at best maybe just a little bit of confusion and then at worst like a lot of suffering down the line.
So well put. There's so many nuggets out of there. Like if this episode of people gain some just overarching concepts, one, question what you are so sure you know. Two, healing is political. Three, ayahuasca can straight up lie to you. It is possible. It is not, do not believe these things at face value. I have fallen into that trap before. I am open enough to admit that. And because again, like you said, there are these new age fantasies that like, she tells you the truth and like don't question the plants, and there's all kinds of ways that things can come through with ayahuasca that can lead you in different ways that are not so face value-y. So thank you for that. And then I think
So
go ahead. Yes.
no, this is probably just like a important point because it ties into something we were speaking about before in terms of like ontology, because it is true, right? Like people are very, very eager to adopt an enchanted worldview, something that kind of like is more appealing than the sort of inert, disenchanted, consumerist, hyper materialistic worldview that we have for the most part in Western society. Which, yeah, I mean, it's very, insipid, and people are craving magic. People are craving, you know, animacy. People are craving like this kind of like Harry Potterian worldview where everything is possible and we just sing the right thing into existence. And I'm not criticizing that, right? But that wish for re-enchanting our worldview, for living in a magical environment, there's a reaction to living in a disenchanted environment in like late stage capitalism, oftentimes can also like really cloud our understanding of what the actual system is that we're dealing with. And this is just like a small tie into what we were talking before, because the Amazonian ontology of like the animistic ontology of the Shipio, for example, yeah, I mean, it is rooted in animism. It acknowledges that sentience is everywhere, that agency is everywhere, that intentionality is everywhere, that the plants are persons in, you know, in a very real sense, that, you know, you are in communication and interaction with entities that are just as real as you. But there's a big stretch between that idea, which I'm also not articulating correctly because I don't, you know, like I'm not a mouthpiece or authority for the Shipio ontology. I don't know what it is, but I know what it's not, right? And what it's not is exactly those caricatures that a lot of people who go into the medicine path tend to derive from that shallow understanding of what Shipio animism is. So we get into like that really absurd kind of like condensations of plant medicine mythology. Right? Like Mother Ayahuasca told me so and so. Like you said, like she doesn't lie to you. Like
Yeah.
who said she's a she? Like the mere
Yeah.
idea of ayahuasca being a female is something that is extremely rooted in Western ideas of femininity. This is not true, you know, from the perspective of Shipibo or most other Amazonian tribes. Like ayahuasca is not gendered; it's not a feminine entity. There's a whole myth behind it that explains very well that ayahuasca is actually the union of the female polarity and the male polarity. Well, that's beside the point. What we're, you know, talking about now is that these ideas of what ayahuasca is a female entity. She's a grandmother. What she says is always true. She's a benevolent spirit. The spirits of the plants, like this idea of like, well, Bob Insana is such and such, and you know, the Katawa tree is such and such. And I mean, this reduction of the animated forces of the rainforest that the Shipibo commune with as a result of very long processes of attuning to the finer sources of sentience in the jungle, turning them into kind of like these caricatures of plant spirits ontologies that people are very easy to market. I mean, you go to the centers, plant medicine centers, and they have like this really absurd catalog of like these are the diets that you can do, and if you diet with Bovinsana, she's gonna teach you about compassion and self-love. And if you diet with Katawa, that tree is going to teach you all about strength and willpower. And if you know, like there's kind of like this classification of plant spirits as if it was a Sears catalog. You can choose what it is that you want to get from your plant diet, which is very much rooted on that caricature like ontological reduction of a complex system of animacy into something that is filtered through a completely westernized, sanitized, hygienized, declothed, detooth, new age caricature of something that it isn't.
Yes, I love you pointing that out. By the way, that is hilarious. I do refer to it as she, just like without even thinking, despite having seen the video where Melissa from Soltara is specifically talking about, you know, debunking that. And
She got into so much trouble for that post, and it was just
so much trouble.
like I tried to chime in and be like, hey, like actually, like, you know, she's right to the extent that this is how it is perceived, right? But like people are so reactive to like having these ideas challenged because we're so attached to like our own caricatures of things.
Right. Well, it gets back to the epistemic. Well, I'm going to just use the word now, Adam. Now I feel totally comfortable just trying to drop this in conversation. Yeah. But the epistemic humility of the people in the comments, they're sure they know what they know about ayahuasca being female.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I was talking to somebody else earlier who is, you know, also works in the psychedelics field. And she was like, it's, you know, we were talking about how it's kind of so hard to continuously defend yourselves against this wave of people that come at you with what they are sure they know, and like it's hard to challenge that. It's you know, like you this is not a fair fight. You know, you cannot fight that sureness with actual information. It's very difficult, and I think that's a lot of what your account tries to point out. And so if you could please tell people, if anybody listening to this doesn't already follow you, please tell people where they can find more about you and your work in healing from healing.
Well, I mean, if you go to Instagram, just type Healing from Healing. I think that's the main platform and will be for the time being. You can also find that on Facebook, but I'm not posting as much on Facebook because I hate Facebook and it's not a good platform for the kind of content that I'm putting out. So you can find me on Instagram, and yeah, that's kind of like pretty much from there onwards, you will see through the highlight reels and all the different links that you will find other ways. I mean, there's a highlight reel where this conversation will also be, where I just compilated like different podcasts that I've done over the last year or so. And there's a Substack coming, which is something that has been on my mind for a long time, which is actually maybe this is a good opportunity to
Tell us.
present
Yes.
that.
Do it.
One of the main criticisms that I get from the page, which is a very justified, succinct criticism that I very much accept, is that oftentimes a lot of nuance missing from the critiques because of the nature of the format, which is true. When we're posting memes, I'm posting like a Instagram caption that is very limited in scope and talking about complex things that can be triggering. Sometimes definitely it can be a disservice when we don't have enough room to actually, develop those ideas a little bit more in depth. So I do want to accept that criticism, also accepting the criticism that short format, other than not being ideal for providing complexity and nuance, it's also to some extent working against us by not really allowing us to develop proper attention focus scope. Again, I mean, I'm guilty of that. Like, it's becoming increasingly difficult for me to do simple things like reading a book because I'm getting so used to the fucking format of like captions and things and like all the dopamine surges and so on. And
Right.
I have a lot of issues with social media. I experience the impact negatively in my own life every day. I'm still kind of like making my peace with it and finding better ways to counteract that impact so I can still do what I do, but without letting it affect me so much. But one of the ways that I wanna like really address that criticism, no, not necessarily for other people, for myself, I do find that it's very important that actually, if there are topics that can be developed with more nuance and complexity, then doing so maybe through Substack, through writing, providing a little bit more of context to some of the things that I speak about. So, I mean, the subtext exists, but I haven't really written anything on it. I think as the last stages of my PhD writing progress, maybe there's going to be some overlap in the things that I choose to write for my dissertation and also go to the Substack. So yeah, I mean, Instagram page, Healing from Healing, and then through there, I will also maybe advertise or let people know whenever that Substack is available.
Perfect. Is there anything that we haven't covered that's burning on your mind and you really want to get across? I want to give you the last platform.
I don't know. I think that was pretty comprehensive. Is there anything else that you think might be
No,
useful?
I just want to thank you for because Adam's inbox has to be the most insane place on the interwebs, your Instagram inbox, because when people always say, "Where do you find this stuff?" You're like, "Other people send it to me," and
Yeah.
my way of dealing with kind of the idiocracy that's out there is I just don't follow anybody with a lady shaman hat or hand on heart or takes a deep breath or any of the things that you make fun of. But you have to see it all to be able to make the critiques. And so thank you for, taking that for the rest of us and for reformatting it into ways that are educational. And I'm very much looking forward to the different ways that you expand this in the future, because this conversation has been so informational for me. I hope that it opens up a lot of other people's minds. Guys, you can still hate on whatever Adam and I say in the comments. Feel free. It just helps increase our Instagram traffic. So really just we're not complaining at all. Your Adam's Instagram post did way better than anybody else's because the comment section was like crazy. So, feel free. Let us know what you think about these ideas that you have. And Adam, just very much appreciate you coming on again and chatting with us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave a rating or review as it helps others find the show. And if you'd like to learn more, you can find the show notes at plantmedicine.org/podcast, and there's information for clinicians at psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Our incredible music was by the one and only Portraying. We'll see you next time.